last decade, the Porsche 911 GT3 has forged itself a reputation as the ultimate forbidden fruit in the world of motoring. You know you want it, but you also know you can't have it, because unless you are willing to do things that some may consider amoral, or pay a fortune in overs to get one, you simply can't have it. And this is rather unfortunate, because with every single generation that has come out, journalists have been keen to remind you just how brilliant the thing you can't have is. But things in the Porsche world, they are a-changing, and if you've been eyeing up this in the classifieds, the 991.2 generation of GT3, a car that I called utterly sublime the last time I drove one, now could be the moment to strike. But before I give it my endorsement, I think it's just about time that I revisit the car on more familiar roads and see if it's just as good as I remember. It does seem like in the last decade and a half, every single new 911 that has launched has done so with a degree of controversy. And it was certainly true for the 991.1 generation of GT3. By this point, the GT3 was already a well-established and certainly well-loved icon. But there were three things in particular that were different about the 991 compared to its predecessors. And those were the fact that, like the regular 991 on which the car was based, the GT3 adopted electric steering, and with the feel of the wheel being so crucial to the 911 and GT3 experience in particular, people were naturally worried, particularly as the regular car disappointed many. Secondly, the fabled and also very much loved Metzger engine was finally retired, being replaced by what's known as the DFI lump for direct fuel injection. And people were concerned that where the old cars had a unit full of buzzy personality, what they were now going to be given was simply a slightly spicy version of the regular Carrera's engine. But perhaps most egregiously for some, the manual gearbox was also retired, the 991.1 being offered exclusively with Porsche's dual clutch, PDK. A very, very good gearbox, but not the manual that driver-focused types who bought GT3s really wanted. But we needn't have worried. Andreas Preuninger, the man responsible for GT product development, is not known for letting down his fans. And with the 991, Porsche released what I feel is one of their most exciting cars. First off, that steering. It may have been electric, but it was light years ahead of that in the regular Carrera, and I think almost as good as some of the very best hydraulic systems. Next up, the engine. Though I, like many, mourned the loss of the wonderfully soulful Metzger lump, as soon as I got to try the new one, all was forgiven. The 3.8 litre naturally aspirated flat six howled its way to 9,000 RPM, making 475 horses in the process and sounding every bit the race car for the road. It is sensational. It also has a beautiful step change at 5 and then 7,000 RPM, rewarding you for holding your foot down the whole way to the red line. For me, it was always a far more exciting engine than that you got in a 458 Italia. And I, apparently, the internet will tell you, am a Porsche hater and a Ferrari fanboy. And it's that engine that really meant the gearbox also made a lot of sense. And not only does it help you keep the thing on the boil, will also be much better on track, but it was also a good gearbox, had personality, had soul, gave you a little kick in the back on high throttle upshifts. I really liked it. I also felt the 991.1 was a beautiful looking car, a gorgeous thing to behold, the right blend of aggression but also elegance. For me, it is one of the prettiest that Porsche have ever made. But there was a bit of a problem, because it seems that somebody cocked up somewhere, and apparently the conrod bolts that Porsche were supplied weren't up to the task, and very quickly the 991 GT3s began suffering catastrophic engine failures. There ensued a period of awkwardness where owners were told not to drive their cars, and naturally they got very, very upset about that. This went on for a little while, and eventually the cars were either fixed, the engines replaced, and people in some way, shape or form made happy. And so, the 991.2, the car I'm driving today, really had a fairly easy job, because all it had to do was take the elements of the previous car which made it great and not catch fire. And it has to be said, it did a magnificent job. I think this is arguably even prettier, particularly here in this gorgeous blue. It's a very, very nice thing to behold. This particular example belongs to my old buddy James, and it is not quite a club sport spec car, so there's not a cage or a fire extinguisher, but it does have these bucket seats, which for me are an essential part of the GT experience. These .2 cars were launched in 2017 and then retired with the arrival of the 992, a car that I never quite gelled with. The engine you have is again the classic naturally aspirated flat 6. It now displaces 4 litres like the old 991.1 GT3 RS and makes effectively the same power and torque. So now you have 500 horses and 339 pounds-feet. That's 470 Newton meters. Even better, for this generation, Porsche said, you know what, you all complain that we only gave you a PDK gearbox, how about this time round we give you a choice? And so you could have your car with either the classic 6-speed GT-specific manual or an evolution of the 7-speed PDK that you had before. The last car I drove had the manual, I absolutely loved it. This one has the PDK, and we'll get onto that a little bit more in a bit. The aerodynamics were revised, improved slightly, the looks altered in line again with the facelift of the base car, but still it was more or less the car that you all knew and loved, just a little bit better. Later, they even offered it with the touring package, effectively a production version of the old 911R. So, GT3 engine and performance, but with more subtle looks. So they ditched the rear wing, and to those that don't know, it would appear to be any other ordinary 911. But to those who do know, it was something fairly special. And that's where the problems began, because this car, like the GT3s before it, was prime fodder for the speculators. And it took all of about 2 minutes before 991.2 GT3s were up on Auto Trader with people asking ludicrous sums for them. Plenty were advertised at well over £200,000 for cars which in many cases had cost £60,000 less. It was and continues to be a very unfortunate situation. But, as promised, things over the last couple of years, they've been changing. And they've been changing in a way that is bad for those that got in to speculate, but is good for those of us that want to get in to drive. Because the last time that I drove a 991.2 GT3, people were still asking some description of overs for them. You still would have had to have paid £150,000 to £160,000, and manual cars definitely carried a premium. But today, something very unusual is going on. Because right now, the cheapest 991.2 GT3 on Auto Trader is a manual. It is up currently for £119,000. So it still commands a fair premium over a 991.1. Those start in the sort of mid-70s to low 80s, going up to about 100,000 quid, depending on mileage, specification, so on and so forth. But even so, I fully expected the cheapest cars to be the PDK ones, because historically those had always been the less desirable. The manual was the choice of the purist and the collector, and so naturally they always cost a fair bit more. With this in mind, I just automatically assumed, okay, yeah, sure, the cheapest one out there is a manual, but there must be something quite badly wrong with it. It's got to be a left-hand drive car with 60,000 miles on it and maybe some accident damage. But no, it's on relatively ordinary mileage, somewhere in the teens, which might be considered high for a GT3, but it's still not ludicrous. There were no signs of accident damage. All right, it wasn't the most exciting specification in the world, but it still had much of what you would want on a car like this. It just seems that if you actually want to sell a car like that in this market, that is the kind of price that you're going to have to be asking. And this poses two very, very interesting questions. First of which is, should you still buy a 991.2 GT3? Is it a good idea? And is your money safe? Is the market going to continue falling? And second of which, what gearbox do I go for? Previously, the choice was fairly obvious. If you really wanted a manual and you were happy to pay the extra, or you were that potential speculator, that was the one you bought. You paid the extra knowing that it should hopefully be the more desirable car in the future. That now is no longer true, and word has it that at dealers, they're less keen to take manuals. And in a lot of ways, this doesn't really surprise me, because when Porsche did finally give people with this generation of GT3 the option of gearbox, 70% of them still went with the PDK. And I've always said that though I really, really love the manual, in a car like this, the PDK, it does make a lot of sense. But until today, I hadn't actually ever had the chance to drive one. I've driven the old PDK, and I've driven this generation of RS, which has the PDK, but I haven't driven the GT3. So it's high time, I think, to put this car through its paces and find out if it's as good as I remember, and if this gearbox is one worth having. First up, the car. It is magnificent. I don't think there's really a 911 GT3 that I've ever driven which is a disappointment. But with many other brands, as the cars have gotten newer, they've lost a little bit of their character. And sure, I've driven a few 996s recently. Is this quite as raw as them? No, not really. But it does bring a lot new to the party, including that engine. It's absolutely manic. My only real regret is that to be able to give you the noise that I know that you want and to keep my license intact, I've had to do a lot of that in first and second. Anything more than that, and I could get in a lot of trouble. And it's a shame really, because that engine is really quite exciting to rev out. It doesn't seem to have quite the step change that you got in the old 991.1. But I have also been told by a few people that actually if you get the new generation of engine, the G Series, that doesn't really do the same thing either. I also have to say, and there's a very good chance that maybe this is some form of placebo effect, but I think this is a car which can be more happily driven off the mid-range in comparison with the 992, the current generation. That really feels like you have to get it to 5,000 RPM for it to do its business. This though, it's not like that. Instead, the power really comes on at about 7, but before that, it's got a nice, decent spread of torque. It's a very pleasant thing, this. You can drive it at sort of 5/10, like I am now, still make very good progress. Feels considerably narrower than the new car too. Makes it a lot less daunting, easy to place. Still got a good view out of that front, but most importantly to me, it feels like a 911 should. The new 992, it's wider, it's grippier, measurably it's better, but subjectively, I just don't like it as much. It's not as interactive, it's not as entertaining. On the road, you can take it to silly speeds and it does it, but it doesn't excite while doing it. This, I'm doing 40 mile an hour right now, flat up to 50. This has the Porsche carbon ceramics, which for reasons I really can't fathom, were still an option with this car, but one very much worth having. The feel through them is delicious, pedals weighted just about right, not quite as squishy as some of the old cars. Got plenty of grip though, but it's that front end which just moves around a little, has grip, but also communicates to you. It pairs with nicely weighted steering, very direct, not overly sensitive, but responds perfectly to your inputs. And this is clearly a car built by passionate people, for passionate people. I know that just recently I did a video with a McLaren 720S and I said, look, for the money, I do not know why you would buy a 911 GT3, but let's just take a moment to remember the fact that the McLaren is only the price of a 911 GT3 because something went very, very badly wrong with McLaren. Were I talking about an equivalent Ferrari, and in this case you'd have to be talking about, say, the 458 Speziale, or maybe even the 488 Pista, you'd be talking about cars which command a £200,000 premium. And when you put it like that, well, it's no contest. Is the Ferrari better? Yeah, maybe, but you don't spend £200,000 on a maybe, do you? This is far and away the best value car of them all, and that's not a token prize, believe me. With the exhaust valve open, makes a beautiful noise too, and there is nothing else on the roads that sounds like a 911 GT3 at full chat. These bucket seats are perfect, the only ones I would ever consider in a car like this. And because this car isn't the Club Sport with the cage, you've got plenty of space in the back for stuff, joining the boot up the front. And there are even a couple of companies out there that will convert these to 4-seater specification. I know Mr. Through Glass has got that in his car, and it's not something I'd probably do with mine, but it is an option should this be the car for you, if only for the fact it doesn't have enough seats. This interior too, to me it just feels so much more logical than the 992s. Rather than a big digital display that you can't see half of, we've got nice analog gauges, which I can see, dominated naturally by a nice big rev counter in the middle, which goes all the way to 10, with the solid red stripe appearing at 9. This thing is just sensational. Over here you've then got a, by today's standards, rather quaint and small screen for your infotainment, but it does more or less everything you'd want, barring Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. Then for your HVAC and that, you've got nice physical controls, and it does everything that I want it to. I think these days you might even be able to get Android Auto or Apple CarPlay retrofitted, but don't quote me on that. This car also, despite the fact it's on just over 11,500 miles, is also in remarkably good condition for a GT3. They are cars that often have a hard life, but this one I think has been relatively pampered. The cover on the central screen, which is normally taken off during PDI, is still there. This is the reason that the front number plate has yet to be fitted. James hasn't had the car for all that long, and he's still trying to work out a way to put one on without ruining the front bumper. Me, I just sticky a plate to it, but he's pointed out that actually it's not quite the right shape for a UK plate, and so he's trying to work out what the best solution is. Could be worse, could have a vinyl one on, and they just don't ever look right. We also both happen to harbour a suspicion that this car in its past life really wasn't ever driven all that hard. James is a rather enthusiastic driver, as you can probably tell by the drive-by shots, and since he's had it, it's really opened up. It's sort of loosened itself a little bit and feels a little bit more entertaining and stronger. Again, that might be a placebo, but knowing these things, I think there's a good chance it might not be. Certainly no complaints with the pace of it, but you might have noticed there is one thing that I've not spoken about, and it's that gearbox. So what's it like? Well, unfortunately, it's a little bit like that in the GT4 RS, the super spicy Cayman with the GT3 engine. It's very effective, it's very good at its job, does exactly what you tell it to, when you tell it to, and it's very, very fast to change. Rarely do you ever have to wait more than a fraction of a second for it to do its thing, and most of the time it does it instantly. The wheel-mounted paddles are not particularly large, but then wheel-mounted ones don't need to be. They are in metal, not carbon, and I kind of like them. They've got a nice shape to them. They feel interesting. But it's the action of the gearbox. It just doesn't feel that exciting. On the upshift, as you can hear there, even when not pressing on, it's quick. But if you absolutely pin it, hold it all the way to 8,000-9,000 RPM, you get a little bit of a kick, but not much more than that. I have got the gearbox currently in sport mode, and that doesn't really seem to do much. I think that's chiefly for when you've got it in drive and it's shifting itself, and then it will do exactly what you expect it to, hold gears for a little bit longer, etc, etc. The suspension, meanwhile, I have left in regular mode, because if you do put it into sport, as I have just now, doesn't really do much beyond stiffen it up and just make the ride less pleasant. With it off, the car works with the road a lot better, and I think it is again far superior to its successor. That feels to me like an RS should. It's far, far too aggressive. This I could live with far more happily. And so my conclusion with this car remains unchanged. I feel it's a nicer car to drive at lower speeds compared with its successor. It is considerably quicker than its predecessor. It is then just as exciting as any other GT3 when you're really on it. Though, if you want the ultimate in interactivity and the steering feel, well, the old 996s do beat it. But this is just a different level of performance. That engine, I think, is an absolute masterpiece, and it might not be quite as interesting as the old early 991.1's unit, but people don't want those. And now, with prices seeming to settle and become vaguely sensible, if you're not willing to risk a McLaren, the 911 GT3 is once again a semi-sensible option. There are just a couple of flies in the ointment. First off, what gearbox would you go with? Well, for me, in a car like this, I think I would have to have the manual. But that's because I'm going to do chiefly road driving. I almost never take my cars on track. In fact, I've been on track exactly once in the last 3 years or so. It's not that I don't enjoy going on track, on the contrary, but there are lots and lots of reasons why I prefer to do my driving on the road. I must admit that I am still surprised that it is the manuals which appear now to be the less desirable option, and whether that's always going to be the case, I don't know. But though I don't think the PDKs are suddenly going to shoot up in value, I think they're also not likely to drop anytime soon. So if you have been considering one of these in any flavour, now probably is a very good time to buy one, because your investment is likely going to be relatively safe. The cars are still fairly new, so you should be able to get them with a factory warranty, no issue. And the other fly in this ointment, you're likely going to want that warranty, because though we all know the .1 GT3 had its fair share of issues with the engine, I have heard lately an increasing number of stories about these also having some problems, and that has come as a bit of a surprise. Now, thus far, this has all been anecdotal second-hand evidence. Oh, my mate knew a chap who'd had a problem with his car, and oh, an old friend of mine used to have some issues with his, so he got rid of it. I heard a story of one gentleman that had 3 replacement engines in his GT3 RS. And if that's true, that's wild. I know it's Ferrari that always gets stick for being the unreliable Italian, but of late, it seems like Porsche have had far more serious problems than they have. But get yourself a factory warranty, and hopefully, even in the worst case scenario, you should be looked after. But if you're still on the fence, what else could you have for this kind of money? Well, there are plenty of other options out there in the world of sports and supercars, with everything from a Nissan GT-R to an Audi R8, a Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera. But perhaps one of the most tempting options would be a Ferrari 458 Italia, itself a much-loved icon that will also rev to 9,000 RPM. But, and I know I'm in a minority here, I just don't think it's actually a particularly exciting car to drive. This, for me, from this seat, it's just far, far better. I know the Ferrari is a Ferrari, and it's going to come with all of the Ferrari things, both good and bad. Higher running and maintenance costs. It's going to be an older car as well, so you might have some issues because of that. There are those then who would appreciate the fact that even compared to a GT3, a Ferrari is going to be much, much more theatrical and attract a lot more attention. And of course then there are those for whom that is not a selling point. But in any case, no matter how you look at it, the 911 991.2 GT3 is a very, very good car. And at this price, you've got to consider it if you can. For me, over the new one, a no-brainer. I'm currently on a journey trying to revisit all of the old cars. I've done the 996.1 and .2, and next up I need to try and find an RS 996 and some 997 GT3s. So if you have watched this video and you've got one of those, you'd like to see it on the channel, please drop me a line, give me an email. My address is in the description of every single video. It's talk@jayemm.com. But for now, all that remains to be said is a big thanks to James for lending me his car, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.